What if Louisiana's Mardi Gras' most joyous night had a tale no parade would ever tell? Why would a lady shackled to silence turn a home center into a fire? And does vengeance become the only language left when the law denies justice? The defiance story of Mary, the enslaved lady whose quiet turn to flames, is revealed tonight. Not only did the sound of trumpets and laughter echo from the town, accompany Mardi Gras' ascent in 1856, but the less noisy duty pulse that burdened the home. The plantation decked itself out in festive hues. However, there was still another form of theater within its walls, one in which every gesture was practiced and every phrase was planned. Mary moved across the kitchen with a reserve that was asked rather than offered, the result of years of servitude. She was Mary by edict, rather than by birth or choice. Her history was inscribed in ink that made it readable for ledgers. There were other names beneath that one, names that were given by voices that had been apart for a long time, and names that she never mentioned out loud, since doing so would have reminded her of the thefts that allowed her to live this life. She carried them like imperceptible yet unbreakable talismans. The proudly scented Mistress flaunted her sophistication in front of guests and received applause. Her own tenderness, which resulted in less noticeable penalties. She referred to it as mercy, without realizing that when mercy demands gratitude, it can hurt more than cruelty. The master made the dignified motions but was unable to stop his kingdom from collapsing due to the burden of debts that followed him like wolves. As other kids practiced games, their kids practiced command, pulling at Mary with commands. Molded by imitation, unaware that harshness had already ingrained itself in them. These minor tragedies were witnessed by the home, which silently documented them. Mary noticed and recalled. Her education consisted of pieces she wrenched out of the shadows rather than officially sanctioned lessons. She learned patient terminology, how slow heat softens meat, and how survival can bend a person's spirit without shattering it from the elderly cook. She heard rumors of rescue that were more often traps, melodies that were disguised as maps, and pieces of roads leading northward from muttered voices. She learned letters from a careless deckhand, each stroke representing a secret that, once known, could never be forgotten. Numbers followed letters, and truth followed numbers. She examined receipts and found the flaw in the pose of the master. As he grinned as if luck were on his side, debts were listed in columns that became steadily larger. The quarters spread. A new gospel as the shadows became longer, yet on Sundays the preacher blessed obedience, referring to it as salvation. Disappearances, shattered backs, and children taken away, not by death, but by transaction, were all mentioned in that gospel. Both gospels were brought by Mary, without inconsistency. One explained why chains lasted, while the other indicated why they might break in the future. Unbroken, silence served as her barrier, memory as her ledger, and patience as her weapon. According to legend, the devil himself walked about Mardi Gras, gathering the things that the earth owed him. When they said it, some people laughed, but others seemed to think that debts too big for men could still be paid off by hands that are darker. Mary did not believe in angels or demons. She believed that every insult, theft, and act of cruelty that was ingrained in her would be tallied and kept in a locked chest like coins. The key was waiting in her palm, but no one else could see it, and the chest had become heavy. That morning, the town's drums blended with the constant sound of oil and iron. Her brief act of dominance was orchestrated by the mistress. While the master practiced lying for creditors posing as friends, the youngsters readied their costumes of faux aristocracy. Mary maintained the fire with a composed expression and perfect quiet. A calculation that had waited through years of fortitude, however, matured beneath the silence. The celebration Mary was ready to release her mask, while the outside world celebrated it. The route, a path crushed by the footsteps of individuals ripped from themselves, existed before the kettle and before the murmurs of suspicion in the household. Mary recalled it like a person remembers an open wound. A root where her brother's hand was ripped away by the wooden ribs of a wagon, where her mother's words faded into nothingness, and where men whose mouths smelled like iron and ink. The house's acceptance of her was not the end of that journey. Every step she took was borrowed, every breath was accounted for by someone else's tally, and it reached inconspicuously into every part of the plantation. The mistress wove in her story of kindness into everyday life, frequently telling guests about the kindness she showed in rescuing Mary from poverty. The costume was charity, of larceny, adorned with lace and ribbons and presented with a smile that begged for appreciation. They called it rescue, but when it ties instead than freezes, the word is loaded with irony. Mary dropped her head, listened, and took in the information. She learned that words, when used carefully, are tools sharper than knives. They don't leave any marks after drawing blood. The mistress polished her own with them. Image, Mary to live, and the master to conceal his frailty. With a hunched back and steady eyes, the elderly cook possessed wisdom that went beyond preaching. She taught Mary that patience disciplines the heart and fire disciplines the flesh. She taught her the importance of being silent when it protects one's dignity, and the risk of remaining silent when it turns into complicity. In Mary examined the gradual action of fire in the smokehouse. She learned the discipline of thread in the sewing room. She learned that survival is the art of saving strength until the time comes to release it, not just endurance, from every aspect of slavery. Then the letters arrived. Careless with secrets and rash with feelings, the deckhand left her with more than quick looks. Mary caught the awkward, rushed letters he wrote in the dust like seeds and pushed them into her memory until they became words. Columns of grain, hog tallies, and debts, owing again and again, were followed by numbers. She discovered a reality, more incisive than any lash when she examined the numbers on pieces of paper that had been haphazardly placed by the fire. The master's his dominion was kept together by borrowed time rather than power, and his house was empty. Even when the master did not speak truthfully, the ledger did. Innocent in the perspective of those who never felt their orders, children arrived as children do. The mistress gave birth to a child one winter, wrapped in silk, baptized with champagne, and acclaimed by everyone. During that season, a baby was delivered in the quarters, surrounded by scraps and whispered by quiet, bathed with fear. One was welcomed as a promise and the other as a hassle. Mary could cradle, but could never claim. Mary swallowed the word as if it were glass when the child was sent away in the sunshine with the justification of necessity. Along with shattered backs, stolen names, ribbon bruises, and the hymn that died on the cook's lips in the middle of the song, Necessity, became another entry in her private ledger, never to come back. The cousin came frequently, bringing news like rot and gossip like perfume. His speech was calm and exact, measuring people's worth the way a butcher measures chops. He talked about marketplaces, transactions, and debts that could be paid off by turning flesh into money. Mary listened as if she didn't comprehend, although each word etched itself into her. Every time the price was brought up, it was like another nail being pounded into a coffin that awaited. Not her body, but the last of her patience. At that moment, she realized that survival, not fantasies, was what was needed. Dreams were not a means of escape, but luxury too expensive for those who risked their lives to imagine them. Freedom had betrayed too many. The forest had mouths, and the river had eyes. All that was left was preparedness, honed in quiet, refined in memory, and preserved in patience. She would remain silent when it suited her, smile when asked to, and bow when necessary. However, every act of compliance turned into an additional coin that was dropped into her chest of reckonings. It became heavy in the chest. It wouldn't stay closed indefinitely. The home thought her hours belonged to it. Mary was aware that she bore their burden. She was handy, the mistress thought. Mary tallied her obligations, and a reckoning awaited in that wordless arithmetic. Instead of thunder, the turn was announced by something insignificant and unremarkable enough for people who thought they were above the law to ignore. It was the child, cunning in his harshness, who, as if it were a carnival trick, ordered Mary to bend and then stand up again. The mistress grinned like she was watching a parlor show as he chuckled, enjoying his own power. Mary complied, since refusing at that moment would have been documented as resistance rather than dignity. Bow, rise, bow, rise. However, every motion signaled a new entry in her secret ledger, in the column of debts that could not be settled. With coins, there was another number. A ribbon later disappeared. With the naivete of innocence concealing dishonesty, the youngster said Mary had taken it. When accusations came from the lips of the strong, truth was not necessary, but the ribbon reappeared nicely folded. Eager to believe, the mistress took the falsehood as proof of her long-held belief that those who must be kept down could never be subdued by gratitude alone. Mary saw at that moment how precarious a life could be when it is predicated on a child's word. The house believed she had been humiliated. Actually, it had made her more determined. The cousin came shortly after, with documents laden with consequences that were disguised as answers. He talked about sales as if they were medicine, and about debts as if they were weather, inevitable, and impersonal. His names resembled catalog goods. In the chain of trade that cloaked itself in civility, every utterance was an additional link. He pronounced Mary's name, but it wasn't hers. Rather, it was the one that was imposed upon her, scrawled in ink, as if ownership could be restricted, through calligraphy. In that instant, the mistress examined her with the calculating eye of someone about to throw away a useless possession. Mary experienced the suffocating sensation of recollection brought to life once again, the unseen road under her and the wagon's slats crushing against her ribs. She carried the burden of the news into the quarters at night. Their voices were quiet, constructing plans out of bits and pieces, of gossip. A woman splattered her hair in designs that alluded to routes heading north. Each braided a map that was disguised as jewelry. Others whispered of songs about rivers and stars, of preachers with keys sewn into their collars. However, melodies might be silenced and rivers deceived as frequently as they provided refuge. Mary paid attention, but with the accuracy of a mathematician, yet with the ears of a dreamer. She had no intention of escaping. She was not destined for endurance. She had no intention of gathering fantasies. She was gathering munitions. The cousin came back with another paper, more definitive this time, the ink gleaming as though it had just been bled. Mary steadied her hands as she made the mistress's tea. Stone, her quiet honed to a sheen. She remained silent, and the entirety of her intention was contained in that silence. She already counted what was hers. The event that numbed the town's senses, the cousin's greed for money, the mistress's haughtiness, the master's fear of scandal, and the children's careless games. She could use it all, but not as a possession. As leverage, however. She went the entire length of the kitchen that evening, touching the familiar iron with her fingers. Unremarkable and charred, the kettle waited like a confidant. Silence. In the parlor, accuracy with the needle and patience were all lessons she had acquired in the smokehouse. The language of fire, the obedience of oil, and the inevitable nature of heat were all lessons she had learnt. These were her actual scripture, her letters, and her numbers. The endurance period was coming to a close. The sum of the years had been calculated. Martira moved closer outside, promising diversion, noise, and masks. Unbeknownst to others, who interpreted her silence as surrender, a reckoning was quietly assembling itself inside, piece by piece. The path that had started a long time ago with it was time for the carts and chains, Ledgers and signatures would not determine the next course of action. Fire would write them down. Martyra grew until it pressed like weather, a pressure of borrowed courage, brass, and laughter on the walls. Wearing a bold perfume, the master went to town on the cousin's arm to turn promises into signatures, which in turn were turned into money. In order to perform little graces in front of a mirror that never contradicted itself, the mistress kept her brooding at home. Time had returned to its more rigorous schedule in the kitchen. With the composure of someone who has already made a decision, Mary lay out the day. She salted, sifted, and measured. She positioned bowls in areas where small hands would wander. As was customary, she left doors open. She allowed habit to divert everyone's attention from what was important. A silence that grew into a tremor was the kettle's response to her patience. She used a melody of civility when assigning errands. The oldest was proud to be trusted and carried spice. A message that didn't require delivery was relayed by the middle. The youngest waited for a later promised mystery. The mistress lingered, embarrassed by the poise that refused to get smaller. Mary praised, thanked, and refrained from using any quote-worthy language. Confident, the mansion sank into its grooves. A routine is a rail. A day will go exactly where it has always gone once it is on it. Heat ascended its unseen stairway. Oil followed the flame's instructions. Iron was able to recall every lesson it had ever received. A hinge grumbled quietly. A latch was in alignment. A draft moved as though the structure itself had drawn a deep breath. The kettle steadied at its pinnacle after rolling close to it. Gravity and a dark star fat. A child protested a slight refusal anywhere. Somewhere the child was corrected by the mistress with a tenderness that only lingered on her tongue. Mary, who had been studying math for so long, groped for its line. There was no flourish, no profanity, no speech, just a clean adherence to cause, and consequence that, to those who survived, appeared to be chance, shielded from reason. The sound gathered, then dispersed. What should have been a harmless stumble turned into a liquid, and quick as a decision, the surface that had waited spoke in the ancient language of pain. Human and unmistakable cries could be heard, along with the desperate scrape of a handle against a door that was all too aware of its duty. There was no silence, only the displacement of silence, thick in one throat and thin in another. Mary was slow in her perplexity. She held her breath while she opened what would open and closed what would close. A delicate relic is carried. By one. She was greeted like a cousin by the ruckus outside. The masks bobbed. Those who were unfamiliar congratulated themselves on their absence. Mary entered the carnival's edgeless permission and walked the yard with a dignity the place had never given her. When spectacles were required, no one sought out a woman without a costume. More intelligent prey, as though they were made of the same fabric. She sliced between the revelers and the rumors, turned where the crowd turned her, and let the city forget that it had ever heard her name. The dark line of the levee remained. Water maintained its counsel beyond it. The alarms gathered behind her. It's too late, too loud, and too quick to blame negligence and clear the way. Smoke carried out the age-old task of revision, softer edges, unclear sequencing, and putting disorder in the clothes of misfortune. It would be phrased by the cousin. This would infuriate the master. Consequence has already been found for the mistress. For none of these did Mary turn back. She had left the tally with the house after giving it its accurate inventory. She was left with movement that was finally unmeasured, rather than escape disguised as mythology. The arrival of night would bring with it rumors. In order to collect statements and misplaced truth, morning would arrive. The kettle would eventually cool down to a commonplace object, as silent as a stone that had caused an avalanche. Without slats or rope, the route that had always claimed her uncoiled ahead. The city, preoccupied with its show of forgetting, let her to pass as she walked it as if it had been waiting for her specific stride. What darkness refused to disclose, morning listed. Authority-wielding men were late, made meticulous notes, and misheard everything that was important. The master returned from town in a state of wonder like to that of fresh linen, and he cursed chance, weather, and carelessness in a manner that pleased him. The cousin talked as though words could smooth out the marks left by fire. Even the best households succumb to fate, he said, referring to the tragedy as a terrible concatenation. Appreciative of causes that spared him the annoyance of intent, the sheriff examined hinges and ash with the sensitivity of a scholar. After being questioned, servants were corrected. Condolences from neighbors sounded scripted. There was a ledger on the desk, heated from the sun, and nobody noticed that some of the columns ended with smoke rather than numbers. Grief did not ask for permission during the quarter. In the same way that maps recall rivers, women braided their hair and wrapped stillness around their throats. There was still an empty educational stool by the fireplace. Careful in grief, the preacher led a prayer, asking Providence to handle what people had been mishandling for years. Children were taught a new quiet, the solemn pause of history, passing through a door rather than the dreadful silence of punishment that was expected. According to one, he saw Mary at the levee's edge, her shadow longer than her body. Another said that she learnt how to be numerous by entering the crowd. Her path no longer required consent, thus no one agreed on it. Competing gospels were drafted by town gossip. In one, tragedy had hit innocence in its sleep. In another, a house that counted flesh and referred to it as the future had been visited by judgment. Until the dark, when doors closed and mirrors, dimmed, polite tongues favored the first story. Then, like coal, the second story glowed. Some recalled how Mary's quiet had weighed, as if it kept something in check. They decided not to speak. Out loud, days without noting can be turned into weeks, and language can be forced to testify against its speakers. A vendor on a market afternoon held out a blackened kettle, its rim notch-marked as though a decision had once been made there, leaving proof in iron. If it had a name, a woman inquired. When men can't afford to know, they smile like the peddler. Money exchanged hands for something that ought to have been commonplace, but wasn't. After moving to a new kitchen, the kettle carried a rumor with it while doing honest work. Years continued with their own calculations. Soldiers showed up wearing sophisticated uniforms that promised an after. Those who had already learnt. Incredulity were read papers out loud. The master bargained with situation. The cousin found that while appetites remained the same, markets had changed. With different drapes and the same bones, the home stood, stooped, sold, and then stood again in another family tale. On other evenings, a draft would gather in the hallway, like footsteps deciding how far to go. Mary's record maintained its clear margin. According to some, riverboats are aware of her name and response. To it in the mist. According to some, she located her relatives and taught them how to be patient with tools. Some remained silent, protecting her absence in the same manner that the cautious guard fire protected, oxygenated, and never showed off. She continued to be an edged quiet, not the void left by noise, but the form of meaning that defies entreaty. Every year, Carnival made a comeback and attempted to regain its previous voice. Doors that recalled heat leaned tight on laughter. There was a pause as short as a held breath before stoves were lit in kitchens all around the parish. When law keeps accounts that leave out the living, what arithmetic answers back? It inquired in an unspoken manner. What language remains to speak for the taken when mercy is priced and sold? If tolerance is a type of what was the intended purchase with the savings? There was no search for answers in the questions. While they maintained time as steady as a heart, a woman with numerous names was walking down a path that belonged to her stride at last.